Yeah, forgot about her. Yeah, okay, I'm Claude Newman. I'm a longtime board member of Wild Connections. Tonight's webinar, I want to welcome you, is on climate change. And our presenters tonight are Karl Ford, longtime scientist, advisor to Wild Connections, and former board member. Karl will be talking about climate change and commenting on the video after which will run first. And Karl will be talking about his upcoming book called Colorado Mountain Ecosystems in Crisis. So we're waiting for that. Also be joined by Alison Gallensky, who you have already met, a longtime board member also. And Alison will update us on the climate resistance project that Wild Connections has been involved in for several years now. So we'll start with a 19-minute video done by the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. That's a lab that provides scientific support for scientists and students studying ecosystems. They're located in Gothic, Colorado, near Crested Butte. Probably a nice place to be. And it involves a study they did over 20 plus years of heated plots studying the effects of the heating on various ecosystems. And Karl and Alison will talk more about that after the video. There will also be a question and answer session if you have any questions on any of this. So that's my introduction. Hope you enjoy it. All yours, Alison.
Global warming will be worse than we thought. The truth is, we're underestimating the warming with our current predictions, because those predictions don't include the effects of ecological feedbacks. That's a really important message. "23 years ago, 1988, I started asking the question, how will ecosystems change in response to global warming? So I set out to try to project into the future how the ecosystems in this valley would change. And the way we went about it was to set up an experimental heating. We took electric heaters and suspended them over a meadow. We created 10 plots, each is 10 feet by 30 feet. We've been heating them for 20 years, day and night, summer and winter. If you imagine a stove on a low setting electric stove, the filament, it wouldn't glow, there'd be no light, but it would be warm. The soils are about 2 degrees warmer. The foliage warms up, the soils get dry, and snow melts several weeks earlier in the heated plot. It's like a very subtle radiant flux of heat, just like what the big heater in the sky called carbon dioxide is doing to the planet. Except we heated 2 or 3 degrees rather than just the 3/4 of a degree, which the planet's already been heated by the greenhouse gases. This is called a data logger. There are 180 probes in the soil, and every 2 hours those probes send a signal to the data logger telling it what the soil moisture and the soil temperature are. So then we come out here every couple weeks with a laptop and download the data and put it into a database. So we're looking ahead 40 years maybe into the future, and over the 20 years we've been able to document enormous changes in the ecosystem. 2 examples of effects of the heating. One is on the plants that grow in the meadow. There's a species of plant here called sagebrush. Here it is. It's very sparse. You don't see much sagebrush in these meadows. It is now the dominant plant in the heated plots. It's taken over, outcompeted the flowering plants like the daisies and the yellow flowers and the various beautiful non-woody plants that you see. So woody shrubs are becoming dominant in just 20 years of experimental heating. The other thing we've documented is the loss of carbon from the soils in the plot. The ecosystems store huge amounts of carbon in soil, about 4 times as much as in the atmosphere. So when you lose 25%, 1/4 of the soil carbon, which is what we've lost in the heated plots, if that occurred worldwide, it would mean a doubling of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Well, what has humankind done? So far, we've raised the level about 30%. But the potential is there for not just the carbon from fossil fuel burning to heat the planet, but the carbon released from ecosystems to further heat the planet. We call it a positive feedback effect. Not positive because it's good for you, in fact it's terrible for us, but positive because it reinforces the direct human effect.
And when you change the plants, you change the animals. The butterflies are utterly dependent on plants. Most of them only feed in this area on 1 or 2 different species. So you can easily, as the sagebrush moves in, you're going to move butterflies out automatically and other insects.
Well, of course, one of the questions that comes up a lot, and as it should, is not just with extinctions, but with the accelerated pace of climate change and warming. The rapidity with which these changes are occurring.
That's what most surprised us about the experiment. 7 years into the study, the soils had lost 1/4 of all their carbon. 1/4 of all the organic matter had burned off the soils. That is really fast. Now that's when you heat by 2 degrees, but by 2050, we'll have actually heated these meadows by 3, 4, maybe even 5 degrees. So we're in for very rapid changes. Shifts in the dominant plant community were showing up in the experiment after about 6 years. People think, oh yeah, you can't change nature quickly, but you can. It can change virtually overnight on human timescales.
So where we're sitting, sagebrush is clearly an indicator species.
Absolutely.
That's opportunistic and taking advantage of climate change.
Yeah.
What are some of the other revelations that have come from your research here?
Replacement of flowering forbs with sagebrush is important. First, there's a practical reason. Ranchers have used these meadows for grazing their cattle, and the cattle like to eat the forbs, not the sagebrush. So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is also has to do with the local economy. This region, Gunnison County, is sometimes called the wildflower capital of the Rockies, and hundreds, if not, I think this year it'll be at least 1,000 people flock to Crested Butte to take part in the Wildflower Festival. And will there be wildflowers here to see in 40 years? We predict no. We predict that you'll have to have a sagebrush festival.
So often people speak of the canary in the coal mine, and And for butterflies, how emblematic are they?
This is a butterfly of a group that generally lives in the north. It's got alpine species, it has Arctic tundra species. It's found, the same genus, and very similar species are found in the mountains of Central Asia. It's whole Arctic. That means it occurs all the way around the northern hemisphere. And these move around a lot as individuals. Many butterflies stay essentially where they hatched. But this is a thing called Arebia epipsodia. It's not a particularly spectacular butterfly. It's a group called the Satyrini. It's a group of four-footed butterflies there. Their front legs are very much reduced and uses the antenna cleaners. And this is one that we worked on starting back in the early 1960s, because in those days nothing was known really about the biology of butterflies.
Well, tell us why we should care about invertebrates.
Well, I'd have to speak very slowly in very simple words if I'm going into the Congress. I'd say little creatures like this run the systems that support our lives. And if they should disappear, we'll all die. It's probably too complicated for Congress, though. We're going to see how many people Earth can support before we have a collapse and most everybody dies off.
We are a living laboratory.
We're running an experiment.
It's amazing. It's the most unholy experiment maybe in the annals of biology, but we're doing it.
Not just in our lifetime, in the last year, because of climate change, we're seeing a transformation of the physical Earth on a scale that hasn't occurred for 3 million years.
And
it's amazing.
It's also important to remember that that huge geological change caused directly by human activities. That is, the same addition of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere that goes up with human population is what has caused a geological event, the scale of which is unprecedented in human history.
That's the single biggest thing in our lifetime on the face of the Earth, and it's due to human activity, it's due to population growth and overconsumption. But in the next 100 years, we're going to see a lot more events on that scale. We may see the shutting down of the thermohaline circulation in the Atlantic, which is a temperature difference between equator and pole. So as we shrink that difference, we're going to alter the circulation of the oceans. That could be as bigger a deal even than the melting of the Arctic ice and the opening up of the channel between the Pacific and the Atlantic. So that's one example. There are many, many more.
Paul, what would be another?
I was going to say counterintuitively, you could have a warmer Earth with a much colder Europe because of the shutdown of the thermohaline. The world is not going to warm or cool if it cooled uniformly. You're changing a very complex system, and it's going to make some places wetter, some places drier. That's going to clobber our agricultural system. And since one of the main uses of land surface of the planet, the single biggest one, is agriculture. And one of the things we're doing by changing the climate is threatening agriculture with all kinds of disasters. So in a sense, we could have an agricultural disaster that's on the scale of a geological.
Why should we care? Well, the ranchers should care because cattle don't like sagebrush. The economy of Crested Butte should care because the wildflowers here bring in a huge amount of revenue to the county. Am I an optimist or a pessimist? Depends how you frame the question. If you're asking me, will the world be tolerable if we don't do anything about global warming, I'm really pessimistic. I think we're going to suffer enormous damage, not just to ecosystems and biodiversity, but to food supply and protection from the extremes of climate, drought and storm and fire. I would worry tremendously about all of the forests you're looking at here going up in smoke within the next 40 years if we don't do something about global warming. So I'm a pessimist about what the world will look like if we don't solve the problem.
It has part of its wing that was bitten off by a bird, it looks like. It was flying around trying to decide where to lay an egg on the aspen.
And we're looking at a plant called Androsace, a small, short-lived plant out here. And we're looking to see adaptation to climate, both experimental climate manipulation here and also climate on the elevation gradient up and down the mountains here.
But I'm an optimist about the opportunities to solve the problem. I believe that the solutions are in hand, they make economic sense, and they're technologically in hand. We have the engineering and the economics to back up clearly workable solutions to global warming, improving the efficiency of automobiles, replacing coal with solar. All of these things are in our hands. We can do them. What we lack is the political will to bring about these changes. And the reason I think it's so important isn't just because of global warming, but it really goes to the heart of our economy and our overall well-being. Nobody wants to see more oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody wants to keep fighting wars in the Mideast over oil. And as long as we're dependent on foreign oil and burning coal, we're going to continue to have smog in the cities, mountaintop removal, acid rain, and global warming. But we could end all that. Yeah, it's a really important question. Can we wait? We don't want to wait for catastrophes and irreversible climate change. We should be trying to reduce emissions rapidly now. When I'm asked how fast should we act, I always say we should do as much as we can, as fast as we can, and as smartly as we can. The single most important first step would be to get the money out of politics. And as long as the coal and oil companies have this enormous power through the lobbying process and through campaign gifts, we're not going to see change. So we have to have campaign reform. Otherwise, the democratic process will not work.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Karl Ford to talk a little bit about climate change, other impacts of climate change on our forests.
Just a quick note before I start. When I was a young man, just entering college, I read The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. And that was him. And that book was written in 1968. And he's always been kind of a distant mentor to me. And John Hart, likewise. They're both very eminent scientists from Stanford University. And if you haven't ever been up to the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab, Colorado Mountain Ecosystems and Climate Crisis. And I'm calling it a field report from the Colorado Trail. I hiked the Colorado Trail for the second time in 2020 and 2021. And I saw all the 100 miles of dead forest and forest fire burns and so forth. And so it really prompted me to try to pull together some of the science of what's going on here in Colorado. We're not talking, sea level rise or melting of ice caps exactly, but we do have some serious problems. And so I'm going to talk about the science findings that I pulled together from hiking the Colorado Trail, mainly on forests, wildfire beetles, spruce beetle in particular, and fuels mitigation, a little bit about wildlife and apex predators, a little bit about the hydrologic systems gone haywire. The book also, as I go along the trail, I try to weave in a lot of what I call environmental history. It's not really my term, but it's a whole field of history these days about, in my case, native tribes and cheap uray, about public lands and wilderness, also mining, grazing, the forest structure change on the Colorado Trail, and overall population growth in Colorado. I've been in the state since 1969. And I've seen huge changes, as you probably have too. This is just a quick picture or map of the Colorado Trail. It begins here southwest of Denver in Waterton Canyon, winds through the Pike, San Isabel National Forest. And I did this portion up to Monarch Pass here in 2020. And it's about 250 miles. And then I did the second portion on the western slope in 2021. I will say that this first portion is mostly in the Wild Connections geography. So one thing people ought to be aware of, if you're not already, is weather and climate are not the same thing. Weather really is what are the weather conditions today, next week, the last week, next month, maybe up to a year. But when you start talking longer time frames, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, that's climate. And climatologists have been studying ancient climate as well as now they're doing these climate models into the future. Also, you probably are aware of this mega drought that's been going on west-wide. We hear in Colorado how it's been, 20 years of extreme drought, and it has been. But really, it's 1,200 years of mega drought. And that we know that from the study of tree rings and sediment cores and glacial ice. And although the video talked about a couple degree warming in the study, Western Colorado is already increased by 4 degrees, almost 4 already in 2023, should be hitting 4 in the next year or two. And the Forest Service and others are projecting, depending on which climate scenario you're talking about, it could go up by 9 degrees Fahrenheit in 2090. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you're an ecosystem, that is dramatic and potentially catastrophic. Precipitation, pretty much we're talking snow here. Rainfall, summer precipitation may not change too much, but we're seeing a declining western snowpack. And some authors are predicting that we'll have low to no snowpack in 35 to 60 years. So I have a granddaughter, and she's going to be around for that. And we just taught her first time skiing a week or two ago. And I I hope and pray that skiing and snowpack is around for many generations to come. Recent weather, we talked about the extreme drought of 20 years. In 2020 and 2021, I was hiking in extreme drought. And I'll also mention the wildfires that flared up then. This year, we've had a good winter snowpack, and that's certainly welcome. It's really not going to help the Colorado River significantly. Every little bit helps, but I'll talk a little bit more about that too. In fact, the Colorado Trail watersheds release water from their snowpack into the Rio Grande and Colorado River, two of the major western rivers. And we have a crisis situation on the Colorado River and the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande dried up in New Mexico in 2020 through Albuquerque area. And of course, Lake Mead and Lake Powell are only about 25% full. And they're getting to the point where they're almost going to have to shut off the turbines that generate electrical power. And finally, as the snowpack melts, snowpack creates an albedo effect of reflecting sunlight back from the earth back into the atmosphere and keeps the planet cooler. And the ice caps do that, but so does our alpine snowpack. And as that snowpack melts, it causes the ground, which is darker colored, to absorb more heat. And it's one of those feedback loops that was mentioned in the video that kind of continues to increase warming and evaporation. Just a quick look at, this is, let's see, temperature over the last, since 1895. And basically, the red bars are the exceedances over baseline, or excuse me, over 0 degrees. So the 0 actually is no change from the average of 1900 to 2000 if you look on the left legend there. So we're looking, in the video talked about at least a 2 degree change worldwide, really. That's Fahrenheit, or about 1 degree Celsius. But in Western Colorado, we're seeing more like 4 degrees. This graph is for Colorado as an entire state. This is for the Pike San Isabel National Forest. This is, again, temperature. And the shading is really difficult to see. I can barely make it out on my screen. But if you look at the legend down here, and these are in degrees Celsius, so it's talking, and they're really small increments of only 1/10 of a degree. But we're talking between 4.5 to 5 degrees increase by 2090 if we don't intervene and actually change things. And that is, again, that's where we're getting the 9 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Precipitation, not a major change. This is summer precipitation. The big change is going to be snowpack. We may get the same amount of snow, but we may get the same amount of winter precipitation, but it's going to be more rain and rain on snow. And what snow we get may melt quickly. So as the landscape dries and warms, it doesn't take much of ignition to create these big fires. This is a shot of the Hayman Fire, which is in the Wild Connections geography. And now, after 20 years, there's still very little reforestation going on. Shrubs have come back. A few places, aspen have come back, but mostly not effectively or extensively. So I focused a lot on forests when I was researching the book, and it should be no surprise to everybody that the forest structures changed due to harvesting back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. They clear cut for mines and to build cities. And since the Smokey the Bear came along in the 1920s, we've had fire exclusion policies, which have made for really dense fuels on the landscape. And if you've done much hiking, especially in wilderness areas, really anywhere, You can drive over Wolf Creek Pass or Monarch Pass and see what I'm talking about. And the Forest Service is still doing clear cuts in the name. They're calling it fuels mitigation and trying to co-opt the banner of dealing with the effects of climate change and wildfires by doing really what's logging. And what they should be doing is thinning the small trees and leaving the larger trees. They're the mother trees, which sequester the most carbon and will reproduce the forest. Instead, they take the big trees and the small trees and leave a clear cut. Studies are also showing Colorado forests are no longer sequestering carbon. They are a net carbon emitter, which is, that's just a darn shame. We have 24 million acres of forest in Colorado, and we're emitting now more than we're sequestering. And that's because, and this really didn't come across in the video, why is the soil carbon decreasing? There's soil carbon and there's carbon in the forest, in the wood. The soil carbon and the wood, as the wood dies from forest fires or just overcrowding, it gets decomposed by bacteria, and the bacteria then release carbon dioxide. And so hence we're now a net carbon emitter. A big finding with many studies now is that those low elevation burn forests are not regenerating, i.e. the Hayman fire. And the fires are bigger, they're mega fires, and they're larger than 100,000 acres. In my hike, I started in 2020, it was dry. And later in the year, the East Troublesome Creek and the Cameron Peaks fire flared up, in the Spring Creek fire, greater than 700,000 acres. That's just enormous by our state's averages. Historically, between the 60s and the 90s, our total statewide burn area was only about 20,000 acres, statewide. And in the 2000s, we averaged 85,000. In the 2010s, 100,000. But going back to this 700,000, if we did that per year, and I'm down at this next to last bullet, in a decade, that's 7 million acres. We only have 24 million acres in forest. And that kind of burn rate is unsustainable. And now with the Marshall Fire, we're seeing that the fire season is year round. So switching over to spruce beetle, went through many, many miles of dead forest along the Colorado Trail. This is a shot I took in the La Garita Wilderness. So most people, we've been hearing on the Front Range about the mountain pine beetle, and I'm just going to skip through this really quickly. But it's mostly a Front Range. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's really in the northern half of the state. A lot on the western slope in the northern half. And of course, they drill into the Cambrian, and too many beetle attacks kills the trees. What used to be a 2-year life cycle is now a 1-year cycle, and so hence more beetles because of warmer winters. But what I saw in the southern half, especially the southwestern part of the state, is the spruce beetle mortality. And the outbreak started around Wolf Creek Pass back in the late 90s. Now it's the single largest source of forest mortality in the state at 1.8 million acres. That's a lot of land. In the San Juan National Forest, 40% mortality of the forest. Also very high in the Rio Grande National Forest. Some people think these beetle-killed forests are greater fire hazard, but it's actually not true. The green forests, if they're dried out from drought, they still have a lot of pitch in them, and they have a lot of fine fuels, and they will burn more extensively and hotter than an old beetle-killed forest. There's some pros and cons when you look at the biodiversity picture with the beetle-killed forests, but generally speaking, you have less biodiversity in the beetle-killed forests. Here's some larger views in the San Juan Mountains of beetle-killed forests. What about wildlife? Well, what they're finding at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab is the plants are blooming earlier, and they're getting out of sync with pollinators, with hummingbirds The insect pollinators are declining. You've probably been hearing about honeybees. Well, so are the native bees, and we have several thousand species of native bees, and they're all declining. The western bumblebee is down 72%. Some pollinators are birds, especially hummingbirds, but we have a real biodiversity crisis with avian species. In the United States, birds are down 3 billion birds. A few years back, Wild Connections did a banding project for the very rare now brown-capped rosy finches. They're an alpine bird, and that was done up at Mises Cabin up in the Terriell Mountains. And many other birds, alpine and subalpine birds, are vulnerable to climate changing as well. Another study in Colorado is finding small mammal ranges are shifting upwards 430 feet up the mountain in Colorado. Pika were thought to be vulnerable, but now some research is showing that they're more adaptable. The ones I'm concerned about are lynx, snowshoe hares, wolverine, although they're probably extinct in Colorado, moose. Moose really can't tolerate hot weather. Cutthroat trout, they can't tolerate warm streams. And bats too are showing reproductive problems. And finally, on this slide, as we talked about with the wolf webinar, we need more apex predators to help restore and regulate ecosystems. This slide's about some of the human aspects of it. So Colorado's grown to almost 6 million. It was about 1.3 million when I came to Colorado. So that's like a almost five-fold increase. And it's easy to see up here, up and down the Front Range. We're expected to continue to grow by 2030, another 600,000 or 700,000. Several million people live in the WUI, the wildland urban interface, and they're at extreme risk from wildfire. Plus, we have an explosion of ORV use, outdoor recreation, and all of those are sources of ignition. So we really have to do mitigation, especially in the WUI and the low elevation forests. Thinning is probably okay. Prescribed burning is scientifically shown to be more effective. Logging, taking all the trees causes more carbon emissions. And it's actually scientific studies on this. Logging causes greater carbon emissions than leaving the trees in place. And prescribed fire is better. So here's just a little quote I want to read you from my book. I will say the book is in publication at the University of Colorado Press. It's probably going to be a while, but I hope to have it out sometime this year. But in kind of towards the end of the book, I kind of philosophizing. Picture future southwestern forests with 4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming in our children's lifespans. Picture no snowpack. Yes, no snowpack. It's more than possible. On the current trajectory in the high altitude forests, some aspen and subalpine fir emerge from the dead gray spruce skeletons. Drought hardy limber pine and bristlecone pine may increase their range or not. Drought hardy mid-elevation lodgepole forests may survive, but continuing pressure by drought, pine beetle, and wildfire are likely to reduce their extent too, and slowly yield to ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and gamble oak. Aspen and subalpine fir may extend their abundance and range in wetter areas. And in turn, lower elevation ponderosa pine, Doug fir forests of the montane may transform to pinyon juniper, woodland, shrubland, or grassland. So these changes have started, and they're going to happen in probably my children's lifetime. We'll hold all the questions and till the very end, and I'm going to turn it back over to Alison.
Thank you, Karl. I'm going to finish off the presentation by talking a little bit about a climate planning mapping project at Wild Connections that I've been working on with Karl for Wild Connections. So let me bring up my slides. Yes. Okay, first of all, I'll start by showing the Wild Connections region because that'll show up in one or two other slides. Wild Connections extends south from Denver, mostly west of I-25, east of the Continental Divide and east of the San Luis Valley. The Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory is somewhere over in this area. And the Central Colorado Climate Resilience Project that we've been working on has a goal of identifying places where biodiversity will continue to thrive as the climate changes. And this is a collaboration between Wild Connections, that I'm a long-term volunteer for, and Rocky Mountain Wild, an organization that works on biodiversity across all of Colorado and the Southern Rockies region, and that's where I work. And the approach we have taken is to look for places where models suggest that biodiversity will persist even as the area warms. Certainly there's hope that changes in how we're using fossil fuels and in how we're encroaching on natural areas can make a difference and can slow the rate of climate change. But the climate will change in the meantime, even if we take aggressive action. But there is good evidence that some places will be less vulnerable. Either the climate will remain, will not change as quickly in some places as in others, or there are enough things like wetlands in the areas that even if the climate does change, biodiversity will remain. And the way we did this modeling was to combine a number of different data sets and models from different organizations. And we came up with this map showing our entire area. The areas shown in green are areas that we believe will be climate refugia. So those places I was mentioning where the climate won't change as quickly, or where biodiversity will persist because of the presence of wetlands. And then these areas in brown show corridors that can be used by animals and plants that are, animals that are migrating, and animals and plants that over time are shifting where their ranges are, where their habitats are. And the way we've been using this model that we've recently completed is to evaluate areas for their climate characteristics. Browns Canyon is a fairly recently designated national monument that's between Buena Vista and Salida. It's an area that was showed up well in our modeling. It has very good current diversity, the best, and it ranked almost as well for climate resilience and connectivity It's also within a decent sized area that is unfragmented, which is what we mean by natural landscape. That's in the lower elevation part, that is the wilderness study area, and the higher elevations managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The higher elevation area that's managed by the Forest Service did not rank quite as well, but it's still better than average across all 4 of our things that we were modeling. This is how an example of how we're using the results of this model to identify places that are very important to have added protection. Browns Canyon got that protection through being designated as a national monument. We're looking for places to propose as wilderness study areas and areas of critical environmental concern. When the Forest Service is doing its planning, we'll be looking for places for them to consider to recommend as wilderness. We're also using this to identify places to get you, our supporters, out on the landscape and learn about climate issues. The next steps in this process will be to advocate for protecting places that are resilient to climate change, and to present these results to the land management agencies to help them to understand better how to take climate resilience into effect with their planning. Wanted to mention something that you can work on right now, which is to support the Bureau of Land Management's public lands rule that they've just proposed. They want to prioritize health and resilience of ecosystems across the lands that they're managing, which is a lot of the lower and mid elevation lands across the Western United States. I was just looking at their proposed rule, and the word resilience occurs 94 times in their proposed rule. Climate change occurs once. So they're focusing on what needs to happen in the face of climate change without drawing attention to that more controversial term. Comments are due June 20th. Wild Connections will be sharing information about this and reminding you. You can go right now to actnowforpubliclands.org and learn more about this and submit comments. Another thing that's happening right here in Colorado is that Colorado Parks and Wildlife and a number of other Colorado agencies are working on the just started work on the Colorado Conservation, Outdoor Recreation, and Climate Resilience Plan. And they are using an approach similar to the modeling approach that we used for their mapping. And they're working through the Colorado Outdoor regional partners, including 2 in Wild Connections region outside 285 and Envision Chaffee County. And Wild Connections is strongly involved in outside 285 and has some connections in with Envision Chaffee County as well. Want to thank you for coming to this presentation. Give a chance for questions, which you can put into the chat, and here's some information about how you can contact us. Also encourage you to go to wildconnections.org to learn about our upcoming events. And of course, in order to make all of this happen and keep going, even with a small organization like Wild Connections that it does a lot of its work on volunteers. We do need some money to make this happen, and if it's in your if it's feasible for you, I can encourage you to think about making a donation. If you'd have any questions, you can put them into the chat. There was a question earlier about the video, if it's available online, and it absolutely is. And we will send out a link to that in a follow-up email to this presentation. You can also unmute yourself if you have anything you want to say, and I'll turn it over to Claude.
Okay, thanks very much, Alison and Karl and our audience. Are there any questions? Does anybody have questions for Karl or Alison? Okay. If not, again, thank you. I hope you'll continue to support Wild Connections. We have a couple of hikes coming up in May where we try and talk about issues and go to places that we're trying to protect. We're also developing some field projects that we are hopeful will go this summer, where we will need field help, and that's very satisfying. I've always found it very satisfying. We've succeeded at closing off illegal roads, working with the Forest Service, and therefore opening up many thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres more to biodiversity and wildlife connectivity. And if you have special skills and interested in giving to volunteering to Wild Connections in that way, we always have a need for that. So thanks everybody again, and hope to see you at the next presentation.